Hello, James.
Good evening.
Right, we're going to start with media coverage of that video of the beheading of the American journalist, in particular attempts to block it being shared on social networks.
That's right. If we take a look at this tweet, Jade, it's the first tweet that was issued with the hashtag ISIS Media Blackout. Now, the person who tweeted it is a Muslim woman at Libya Liberty, and she said the only two weapons ISIS have is the propensity for violent, gruesome murder and an internet connection. Take away one. In other words, stop giving them the oxygen of publicity. I refuse to be an instrument of extremist propaganda, and I will not share any violent images. R.I.P. James Foley. That was another person who tweeted under the same hashtag. So this was the first, and it took off, Jade. Really, there were tweets all over social media calling for a refusal to share the violent image of his execution. Now, social media organisations got in on that. You have Twitter, for example, who said that they would indeed censor and block certain accounts. The CEO, Dick Costello, tweeted saying, "We have been and are," I seem to have lost the image there, but he said, "We have been and are actively suspending accounts." Now, YouTube did the same.
Took it down, didn't they?
That's right. They took down that account, and they took down several other accounts as well. Police, for example, then in Britain, also reminding people that viewing, downloading or disseminating extremist material within the UK may constitute an offence under terrorism legislation, which is obviously quite extensive. Some would say too extensive legislation in terms of clamping down on extremist images such as that. So there was a real across-the-board attempt. But then newspapers such as the New York Post, I won't show you the front page, they completely and utterly ignored that across-the-board effort. And you had a lot of people on social media criticising the fact that they went with that image the moment just before he was executed on the front page with the word savage across the bottom. And actually, the New York Post's main competitor, the New York Daily News, did exactly the same thing with exactly the same headlines. So clearly, not so great minds think alike. Unethical and horrendous front page says that. And there was just a wave of criticism. Most of us on Twitter are more respectful than the New York Post on a crusade for Murdoch. And you have lots of tweets saying more or less the same thing, Jade. So it's pretty extraordinary that a publication that actually had the time to think about whether or not they wanted to issue, it wasn't just a reflex retweet, decided to go with that. It's pretty unethical. It seems to be the general opinion there.
Yeah, very interesting. I did actually say that the first journalist who tweeted that video then took it down immediately and apologised for doing that.
Right.
And Vanity Fair has also published, they published a long report back in May about James Foley's original kidnapping when he disappeared in Syria back in 2012. And they've noted how dangerous it has become in these areas for journalists.
And it was actually written, Jade, by a guy called James Harkin, who himself was reporting from within Syria. Now, he speaks about the kidnapping of Jim Foley at the time back in 2012, and Austin Tice, who was kidnapped along with him. And it's a very interesting piece because you get an insight into the bravery, sometimes even, I suppose, the recklessness of journalists who are venturing into Syria at the moment, with over 60 journalists kidnapped in the past 3 years. It is the most dangerous place to be doing journalism in the world at the moment. They talk about since Mary Colvin was killed in Homs in February 2012, much of the Western media drew back from covering the country. You have mostly freelance journalists in there who are being paid very badly, laughably paid, as the article says.
And have less of a safety net as well.
Exactly. If you're not going in there with a media organisation, you're not going in there with the security that perhaps is merited at the moment, which means bad coverage of events on the ground and increased risks for the journalists who are actually taking the risk to go in there. So it is quite interesting. They talk about Austin Tice in particular, who is still in captivity, as having, actually even teasing other journalists in the beginning when he went in, saying, "Seriously, guys, if any of you want to come down here, I would love some company," he wrote on Twitter. And then a couple of months later, he was, in fact, taken hostage. He'd been reporting on human rights abuses by the rebels and not just the regime. So he was being, as I say, brave. Some would say reckless, but in any case, since that, there's been hardly any trace of him, and the headline says it all in Vanity Fair, evaporated. So
certainly it's a high-risk move to go into those sorts of areas and cover these stories.
Exactly. So risky times in Syria.
Absolutely. And how have the French press been reacting to this?
Well, it's interesting. Just a quick look at the Catholic paper Le Croix. They're talking about James Foley actually having spoken in a 2011 letter about his Christian faith. He was actually kidnapped in Libya for 6 weeks at the time. So clearly somebody with bad luck in that regard. And the editorial in Le Croix is looking at the Vatican's position, which is quite interesting to look at because they were very much against any sort of intervention, foreign intervention in Syria, going back to last year when there was talk of that around the time of chemical weapons, suspicions of the use of chemical weapons. And now the Pope is saying within the UN structure, perhaps it shouldn't be ruled out entirely.
Okay, James Creedon, thanks very much for taking us through those online reactions and media coverage. It's time now for our in-depth focus report, and today we head to the volcano.